Imagine a really bad marriage. One where there's abandonment and divorce and betrayal and emotional deprivation, and then on top of it, autism, all the things. I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me. What hope is there for a marriage like that? Well, it's certainly not an easy 1, 2, 3, 4 process, but there is hope. And Shawna Meek, who I'm talking with in this episode, has been through exactly that story and more. And she and her husband are still married. Why? How? What does it look like? And what are the defining reasons to stay or to go? Shawna is a coach for people who have experienced betrayal trauma. She is on the APSATS board of directors. APSATS is the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. She, for some years now, has been helping other people in their grief, their pain, trying to find what healing even might look like, to just kind of get stabilized and take some steps forward. Her husband also, part-time, is working with guys who are struggling with similar kinds of things. Anyway, I don't want to get ahead of her story. Shawna has released a book, Determined for More, a story of perseverance through divorce, betrayal, trauma, emotional deprivation, and autism. So let's just get right to this conversation. Here's Shawna Meek. I am so grateful that you're here with us today. Thank you for coming. We met in person just some weeks ago, and now we get to talk this way, and I'm just really thrilled.
Yeah, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah. Well, we are going to talk about some stuff that's challenging, but that doesn't mean that there isn't hope. And maybe just to get a framework started, you have shared so much of your story now in a book and all, but just maybe lay the foundation. You've had a very, very challenging marriage, and maybe just give our listeners kind of the short story, the big picture of your challenging marriage.
Yeah, you bet. So I'll condense the 25 years
Yes.
into the abridged Cliff Notes version. But I was married about 25 years ago to my now husband. And it was a different journey, a scenic journey for us, for sure.
Yes.
We were married 3 years in our mid-20s, and we were divorced for 3 years. And we were remarried, and we just celebrated 20 years of our remarriage. So a little bit more than the first marriage. But the difficulty in our first marriage got brought and magnified into our second
Sure.
marriage
Sure.
until we found some healing and some recovery. And most of that, at a higher level is, my husband had some attachment issues and some things that we didn't realize were present. I came into the marriage, not seeing the flags and not seeing the yellow flags, and which later became red flags. But I didn't see those. And he left the marriage of his own accord the first time, and felt overwhelmed and stepped away from the marriage, which shattered me. I
Yes.
didn't know the Lord then, but man, did I
Mhm.
come face down on my knees to the Lord through my divorce, which was
Yes.
the greatest gift of the
Mm.
divorce, truly, because I don't know where I would be. I don't know where I would be, not having been, raised in church. We went to church, but I wasn't, I didn't know the Lord at the depths that I do now. And so by the time we went into our remarriage, which I never thought was going to be the case, but it was, it was.
Right.
I said yes at some point in the second marriage proposal. But in our second marriage was where we had a lot of destruction and a lot of heartache, a lot more heartache, with betrayal and infidelity, multiple
Mhm.
affairs, and a lot of emotional deprivation. a lot of things that
Yes.
kept me confused and wondering. Intimacy, very disjointed in a lot of ways, both emotionally and physically.
Sure.
And so obviously with the infidelity, that was a huge part of it. But having met the Lord and really knowing the Lord and then going into this was an incredibly confusing time.
Hmm.
But my husband chose recovery, and because of that, I gave it time to decide if I was going to stay because I knew that I knew at that point that I had a biblical out if I needed that.
Sure.
And I
Sure.
considered that for about a year
Yeah.
after the infidelity was discovered. And so looking at all of that, um, we are now, in fact, the other day, he came up to me and I forgot the date this year. Most years I remember that date of the discovery of all the infidelity.
Yeah.
And he came up to me just 2 days ago and said, 15 years.
Wow.
15 years that, that devastation happened. And so, oh, it just like brought so much back like it was yesterday. And the 15 years hasn't been roses. There's,
Right. Right.
it's been tumultuous in many ways, but it was neat to see him come to me with that and to have remembered that date. And it's significant to remember even the losses of what happened as well as
Yes.
victories. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and you've referenced it briefly, but in your book, you talk in quite a bit of detail about what was going on in you through all of that, and then coming to discover that your husband has been diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and so there's some issues there that certainly play into the intimacy and the communication and just the ability to live together and just so much.
Yeah.
Um, I I know this because you've written it and I've heard you say this, but maybe just speak to uh, it's still a work in progress. You
Mhm.
haven't given up, but there are still hard days. You can enjoy the hope and you can enjoy good moments even while it's still hard. I think maybe for people who are in the hard,
Yeah.
it helps to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the diagnosis it was less than 2 years ago, even still. So he was at the age of 50 when he was diagnosed with autism, which had
Wow.
been present from truly day one. Like I saw some things that I didn't know what it was on the connection and intimacy level.
Yeah.
But yeah, so even just looking at all of that and saying like, what is that? What does that look like, for me in that
Mhm.
journey? So, um, but I think, as I look back at how I was impacted through all of this and what I recognized for me, um, there was a lot of attachment kind of things that were disjointed for me
Yeah.
coming into our
Yes.
relationship, and so recognizing what it was that I was looking for or not looking for at the
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
that really, kind of kept me in a little bit more of an anxious attachment as well. And he was a little bit more avoidant in his
Sure.
attachment. But I
Sure.
think, the hope in it is even in that, even through all the long, treacherous road, there still are it's not buttoned up, it's not tied with a bow. There still are things that are hard in our neurodiverse, what we call our neurodiverse marriage,
Yes.
that are still present. But I think the biggest thing and the biggest hope that I can share even for the listeners is the
Mhm.
willingness to continue to seek the Lord, the willingness, and that comes from me as well as my husband, Kevin.
Yes.
If
Yes.
he's willing to do that work, I'm willing to take those steps. And
Mm.
we're always going to be learning. But when a marriage is difficult and has been destructive as well, there's a lot of healing that needs to
Yeah.
happen. But is he willing to do that work? Is he willing to say, I will grieve with you? Is he willing to say, oh, my communication is off here. How can we make this, work together? So it is a partnership, and there's things that we still have limits around things like one-on-one vacations is still with a lot of boundaries and a lot of
Yeah.
plans. And so there's things like that that there is hope in it, but it's not all buttoned up and exactly what I would have, even what I prayed for all those
Yes.
years. Like, let's get to the finish line of that. That's going to be heaven.
Yeah.
Finish line is going to be heaven for us. And we
Yeah.
know that. We know that it's going to take work for us.
Yeah.
So,
You said several things there, Shawna, that I think are so important. One I want to highlight is that he made the choice to continue to do the work and is still making that choice, as well as you are making that choice. I talk to people fairly often who are in destructive marriages where there
yep.
is trauma and pain, whether it's infidelity or something else. And I love how you highlighted that because I believe that's really perhaps the most important deciding factor of staying or not is, are the people involved, both partners, willing to do work and invite God into doing his work in them?
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. That is something that I do write about this as well. And it came to me a few years ago of what is the marriage I will be willing to stay for? And
Okay.
what's the marriage I will not be willing to stay for? And
Mm.
when God gave me that prompt, I guess, if you will, it wasn't even about my marriage. In
Yeah.
essence, it was about what is the marriage? And so I got to really look at it at a higher level of one that is growing, one that has, living water kind of,
Yes.
and God's living water, like seeking that. And I know we don't have control over what the other person does,
Right.
but what is that shows me that God, how many times did I come to God and say, either praying to release me
Yes.
or praying
Yes.
to begging to stay or begging for something to happen and not it wasn't happening the exact way I wanted it. And that wasn't because I wasn't praying right or any of that, but looking at what is that marriage? What am I looking for myself too? And I've
Yes.
got to continue to do the work because as I change, the dynamic changes
Yeah.
in one way or the other, or,
Yeah.
many different ways.
You write about a lot of the work that you did yourself.
Mhm.
Of course, the impact of your husband's issues on you, including the infidelity and so much more than that. Um, but it's more than just you hurt, although you have deeply. But you went through a lot of your own work in, I want to use the word growing. You have done a lot of 12-step work,
Mhm.
a lot of trauma healing work for yourself, that this wasn't only about my husband is behaving badly, which he had been.
Yep.
This was about you in your soul as well.
Mhm. Yeah. That was, man, so many times just wrestling that next thing. Because one of the things that I remember saying this to him, um, even probably even before the infidelity was discovered, because that emotional deprivation was like the torture that kind of, I'd come to him and he wouldn't respond, or, he'd leave the home and after a fight and I'd feel abandoned and all of that. And I remember saying to myself on multiple occasions, but I remember early on saying, I will heal with or without you.
Mhm,
Like,
mhm.
God has given me an opportunity to heal.
Yeah.
Now, God can heal us in a snap, and he asks us to take steps. He
Mm.
asks us to do that. And so at every point that I felt that nudge or that conviction from him to, okay, it's you, like, look at what you can do in that
Yeah.
moment, because you may not be able to control what your husband has done. And this can be anyone in our lives, really.
Right.
But that point of going, I will heal. I will. I
Yes.
will come to that. And I don't know how much will be on this earth, but I know that I'm going to take that step. And and it came with wrestle. It wasn't an easy, yeah, let's just go do that. But, whether it was the trauma healing in that season or the 12 steps, I did my 12 steps twice.
Mhm.
And back then I didn't, there weren't betrayal trauma groups that I was
Sure.
aware of and things like that. But really, man, I gained so much in those moments that things that I intuitively know how to handle that used to baffle me. Part of the 9 step promises.
Yes.
But it used to baffle me. And I go, oh my gosh, there's something in my brain that healed, or something in
Yes.
my body that healed, or my natural path, or my sexuality, and stepping into that vulnerable space. So there were lots of different points. I know it's condensed into a book now, and I laugh as I kind of read it and go, whoo, that was a lot of heartache, a lot of headache,
Yes.
and a lot of
Yes.
sweat and tears. So yeah.
Exactly. You've used a couple words there that I think are particularly appropriate for what we often talk about here on this program. You've mentioned trauma, you've mentioned sexuality.
Mhm.
We have been talking a lot about sexual story, and I'd be curious how or in what ways your own sexual story impacted how you dealt with the stuff in your marriage, responding to your husband, your own need for, healing and growth yourself. How did that impact what it looked like for you to go through this process?
It impacted it greatly. I will start with that. One of the scariest points of growth for me was approaching, at the time, it was approaching my step work first around my sexuality. And that was the means that I used at the time. I had read books, but my sexual story was one that, you know, I had sex before marriage, with 2 different partners, and I waited till I was 18. So even that feels juxtaposed to me. But in my mind growing up, it wasn't, not growing up in a Christian culture per se. It
Yeah,
wasn't taboo. It wasn't purity culture. It wasn't all these things that my generation probably has felt in a lot of ways. And so 18 was kind of late for me,
sure.
in a way. And that
Yeah,
seems silly now. I don't really promote that to my children or other, means.
right.
But I look at that and I was like, wow, in that moment to have early sexual exposure pre-marriage definitely put an imprint on my
Yeah,
sexuality,
yeah.
as God's, word clearly says. And even though it wasn't extremely promiscuous, definitely, I didn't explore my own needs, even my own desires then, even though it was out of God's plan for me. I also just kind of went into it. Like, I don't know how better to explain it, except it just kind of fell into place. And then
Mhm.
I didn't really have that opportunity to say, what do I enjoy? What is part of my sexual template that I enjoy? And so then I get married and we had sex pre-marriage. In our first marriage, we tried to do it better in our second marriage, but the that just kind of flowed into, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't
Yes.
ask. I
Yeah.
didn't, it's like whatever I had going in was like, that's what it ends up being. Then I had a
Mhm.
few books. Some were not very helpful. Others were like, okay, that's fine. And I just kind of went with it. So I really didn't know a lot of my desires, and that's why I did put the sexuality chapter in my book, which felt very vulnerable, because I was like, oh my goodness, looking at that was already hard. But thankfully, I had many years behind me
Yeah.
since I did that deep work. But I
Yeah.
could look at it and say, what makes me say yes to
Hmm.
having sexual intimacy in my marriage, even many years after,
Right.
fidelity healing? Like,
Right.
now I'm using it as kind of a cover, like, well, I don't really know what I need, so that's fine. Yeah, that's fine, but I didn't really know myself.
Mm.
So, it gave me a
Yeah.
lot to explore.
Yeah. You are illustrating that sex is much more than just what you do with your body in a specific act at a specific moment.
That's
It
right.
has all these, it's connected with expectations and the feeling of connection or not, or
Yeah.
obligation or not.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch more than just the physical biology of it.
Yep. Yeah. The obligation, the beliefs,
Yes.
what did I believe that I needed to be? What did I believe that my husband deserved? That obligation was very subtle to me, but it was impactful.
Yes.
Meaning, like, I didn't have a lot of pressure and obligation from my husband, thankfully, but I put it on myself.
Mhm.
and going, oh, well, it should look like this or it should look like that. Now I know what the word should does to me. It's like, well, that probably wasn't helpful, Shawna. But I
Right.
can look back now and say, look at the difference. Look at the difference in my choices. And if am I emotionally connected?
Yeah.
That's something, you know, and we do have some barriers in emotional connection, and we still do, but we've learned to grow in it and talk about it a little bit more. And it's not perfect. My
Sure.
husband and I can miscue things, and you know, sometimes his less awareness with the autism and that kind of component is I have to be more verbal about what I need, because he's not intuitively capturing that from me and those sorts of things where I thought, well, shouldn't you know that? Shouldn't you know that? Shouldn't I know this? And then we're both in should land. And that's
Right.
not helpful.
Right.
It's not
Which
helpful.
isn't exactly not helpful for anybody.
Yeah.
Uh, well, I want to transition a bit now to the work that you have now been doing for some years in helping others who have been in challenging situations. You certainly have had to walk through so many layers yourself and in your marriage. And as God often does, He takes what we have had to process and uses it, turns it into bread that others now receive.
That's right.
And first, I'd just like to hear about what in your soul between you and God pushed you in that direction.
That's a funny story because um after I went through a lot of the betrayal, I really wanted to help others. I think I always had this helper part of me in
Mhm.
my heart and in my soul that wanted to help. And I knew that I needed to find my healing. I knew that it was important that I don't jump into this work to coach others, which, you know, being in the coaching profession too soon.
Yes.
And some of our life experiences, and we adopted our daughter, and that kind of slowed me down, which I think that was God's plan too. And then I started writing first, and I thought, this is odd. I never thought I would write a book. This was not on my agenda at all. Um, and I started writing, and I got about 80% into my writing, and then it abruptly stopped. And I thought, is this supposed to be published? Okay. And then God kind of steered me over into coaching. And so that, I mean, that was, gosh, coming up on 7 years ago. And so I look at that and I think, oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. So then I put that book aside for 5+ years and or that writing manuscript and eventually came back to it clearly. But I also knew at that point that it was time. I knew that it was time that I go back to school and I decide what how I'm going to provide a support
Hmm.
that I desperately desired 15 years ago.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that was the root of it. And then I knew the training I needed. Like I found APSATS organization. I knew the things I needed to do. But I also, yeah, it took time to get there. But in my heart, I just knew I was like, this is what I'm retiring with. This is a part of my legacy that I'm going to be leaving in the work that I do, which
Yeah.
feels it is so ministry based. I mean, mine
Yes.
is technically 501(c)(3), but it is ministry in my heart
Yes.
to do this work with women, mostly women, some couples. Yeah.
Sure. I am sure that you, in now these years that you've been doing the coaching and so on, have heard some stories that um, a wide range and a lot of pain.
Yeah.
Um, what what do you say when you first meet with someone, usually a woman,
Mhm.
or perhaps a couple? What do you say when they first come to you and they are overwhelmed? They're in the middle of the mess and they may not be able to imagine 24 hours into the future. It is just hopeless.
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough place, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah, it's very unpleasant and it's a very low energy to be in that hopeless kind of despair place, which is where I came to find help a lot of times.
Yes.
And so having walked that, that even gives me the chills saying that. Like having been there and walked that, I think God enables me to hold that space with them. Um, and I really think one of the greatest things is letting people tell their story,
Mhm.
letting people share their pain and be in their pain with them So share in that grief moment,
Yeah.
or that moments, really. I mean, before we can even get into coaching or doing that deeper work, sometimes it's just, I just want to be able to share. Someone
Yes.
understands me. How much healing, I mean, you know this too in the work you do, how much healing that is to just be able to hold that space with them. And even when it feels hopeless, one of the things that I often say is there 2% of hope?
Hmm.
You don't need to be at 100. You don't even need to be at 50. You don't
Yeah.
need to decide what you need to do right now. And so we go back to very basics of survival, which a lot of times when we come in, we come into these deep places of desperation. What are the things that we need? What are the things our body needs?
Yeah.
And how can we be around people that are going to support us in that moment? Because we all need that.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the initial things and
Yeah.
just letting people be where they need to be for that period of time.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning people. I
Mm,
know that there have been many people important in your own story. You've written about that. You've shared some already. But in your work with individuals who are walking through some of this kind of pain, and then in your own story, would you just highlight and talk for a minute about what role people need to play, that we
mm,
cannot do this kind of thing on our own?
yes, yes. And for those listening that might be on the other side, how to support someone in, a situation that's
Yes.
devastating too. Because a lot of times we don't know. We don't know what someone might need
Yeah.
in a devastating moment, especially when it's marriage. Um, I think we're ill-equipped to know, and I know I was until I had training. I mean, I needed formal training. So I'll
Sure.
start from the vantage point of, the person needing support.
Sure.
I am a big fan of finding your circle, finding your tight circle. I say try not to make it more than 5. Your family might love you greatly, but that might not be your top 5 right now.
Right.
They
Right.
might love you so dearly that they are going to advocate and do everything they can to, tell you what you might need to do and, keep you safe. But you deciding what that is for yourself is so
Mhm.
much part of the process. It also can relieve you from holding a lot of those people very close to you, their feelings too. They're going to have
Sure.
feelings. They're going to feel defensive towards you, or, anger and your injustice and those sorts of things in times like that. So I say top 5, keep that circle really tight, because it's hard to hear God's voice. At least it
Mhm.
was for me. And a lot of my, people I work with, if I have too many outside voices, it's too much noise all around me. So that's one thing. And then find those that have maybe walked through it. Not everybody has to. We can find different types in our top 5. We can find someone that really gets it, and we don't even have to say a word. We
Yeah.
can just be in the room, and they're just going to, sit right next to you while you weep. You might have someone else that gets to process and say, I understand because I've walked that.
Mhm.
Or I hear what you're saying because I've been there. So someone farther down the line, you might have a fun friend or someone that's going to keep you, doing something, and you're like, I just want to go paddleboarding for the day and I don't want to talk about this at all today. So who are those people you need in your immediate circle? Because we need that connection. And I'm okay with keeping, that's one of the first things I say, keep it tight. You can
Yeah.
always extend how much you share, but in trauma, in that response, sometimes we would just, either we don't want to say anything and we
Mhm.
pull in, or we want to say everything and then all of a sudden we're pulling it back in,
Yeah.
as time goes
Yeah.
by.
Yeah.
So,
That's great, Shauna. And I want to just break in for a second.
yeah.
Um, it's like your Peter, James, and John people. Jesus had
Yes.
his Peter, James, and
Yes.
John. It needs to be that small group, and they
Right.
need to be in this with you. They're good, like you say, they may have little different roles. In the people that I talk with, they often feel like it's really hard to do that. Nobody cares, or I don't know anybody. And I just want to say, for me, I
Yeah,
I I think that is perhaps the most important single step that you can do, that's going to m- lead you toward healing, is to make sure you have your few people.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And sometimes sometimes those first initial sessions, it's like, who are your people?
Yes.
I know you're not a burden to me, but I know it's a different environment. How can we help? how can we find them and you help yourself find them?
Yes.
That
Yes.
isolation and that, you and I both know. So the listeners that are like, but can I just listen to 1,500 podcasts? I mean, I have those seasons. No.
Bless the podcast
Yes, the
and
podcast, but
all of
not
that.
only.
But no, you need your people. So
That's right.
thank
It's
you for
both
that.
and. That's
Yes,
right. We're going to
totally.
push you past the podcast so you can step out and really be heard. Yeah.
Yes.
And then the
Yes.
other thing, really quick, I'll add. So those that are supporting someone,
Yes.
oh man, listening and letting someone go through their process in their pace and guiding, whether this is a lay pastor or someone in the church or a women's director or a family member or a friend or a neighbor, doesn't really matter. But helping them find someone that really understands
Hmm.
the support that they need
Hmm.
professionally and someone that's been trained in that is really important, but also letting them go through that process. And it's hard when we see people kind of, we can hold those guardrails up as friends and family, and we can hold them up, but let them have some room to navigate their experience and their story and their grief, because that's how we coming and falling. We don't want people falling off the cliff, right? So we can kind of be those barriers at times, but letting them fall, letting
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
fall at the face of, Jesus, and just
Yes.
like, you know, be in the dust with him and
Yes.
right, let our people do that too. And that's hard, especially if we have helpers hearts or empathetic hearts. That's a really hard thing to do. So that's
Yeah.
just my
Mm.
few thoughts for those coming in
Yeah.
loose.
I think that's so important because you cannot do someone's healing for them.
That's right.
To be with them, yes,
Mhm.
um, as they are, doing the work and experiencing the pain. And I'm wondering too, it's just a bit that I have come to understand about neurobiology, if that is part of the reason why even God doesn't immediately remove our pain. There's something that happens as we walk through the process. Part of
Mhm.
it is learning to understand ourselves, part of it is reaching out, part of it is reaching out to Jesus.
That's right.
And we need to do the reaching out.
That's right.
Um, in that, you've mentioned several times how important for you relationship with God has been through
Mhm.
all of this. I am sure that some of the people that you work with are feeling like, and I believe you did at times, well, I'm praying, I'm trying to do everything right. Why isn't God fixing it? Why isn't he making things okay? Why isn't he removing this pain? Let's
Mhm.
just talk about that aspect for a moment.
Yeah. Oh, the waiting. I just think about the waiting in that and really listening carefully um, to God and what he has for us. And I think I pulled out a couple scriptures here to share if there's time, but
Yes,
I think,
absolutely.
okay, I think really I'm thinking of Isaiah 43. So these are on little note cards. I'll kind of hold them up
Okay.
because I had a prayer wall in my last separation and I was like, that is over there. We are going to have that. And so Isaiah 43:19, a new thing. See, I am doing a new thing. Now
Mm,
it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland.
mm,
And I wrote underneath this, circumstances don't always look like what he long term wants the outcome to be. If he's led me here, he wants to do something great and glorious. It's a precursor, multiplication from my good God, seeking to do new inside of me.
mm. That's good.
So I just think of that, and that held me so, you're doing a new thing. Like there was some anticipation in
Mhm.
that. And so to think about how he said that, and I kind of chuckled. Don't you see it? I mean, I kind of put emphasis on the question. Don't you see it, my dear?
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know, but I think, when I can bring the humor into scripture, and also it's a precursor to something. So could it be that he's not answering it because he's got something different,
Mm,
something better? He's not done with that yet. And so it's a precursor. It's going to be multiplied by our faithfulness in that moment. And man, do we want those. Man, do we want those answers. Man, do we want to hear from them. Like, oh, for all the listeners like that are, why isn't he hearing that? He
Mhm.
is. He is hearing it. We're just not seeing that outcome that we think oftentimes is what needs to happen. And he's doing something new. At least
Yeah,
he was for me.
that's
So
really good.
yeah.
Yeah, that's really good.
Um,
Um, you are on the board of APSATS. Let
mhm.
people know, if you would, what
Yeah.
APSATS is, and then also about your coaching practice. You and in some cases, you and your husband together work with people who are walking through some of these things. And
Yeah.
I bet there's somebody listening who feels like, yeah, Shawna understands. I need to reach out.
Yeah. Yes, I'll start with APSATS, which, oh, APSATS community is such a sweet community. So it stands for Association of Partners of Sex Addicts, Trauma Specialists. And they don't need to identify as a sex addict, but problematic sexual behavior. So we are professionals that come alongside coaches, we're coaches and clinicians that come alongside the partners or those that have been impacted by the behavior. And so APSATS.org is a great place to go. You can find people in your area because we've all had the same training and we collaborate really well and really just make sure to bring that partner sensitivity
Yeah,
forward in the betrayal of
yeah,
the story. Because for a long time, and even in my journey, I didn't have that level of support. So that's a little bit about APSATS, but couldn't say enough amazing things in what Barbara Steffens started many years ago to really come alongside partners.
yeah.
Um,
And
and
we will
just
make sure for everybody listening, we'll make sure that link is in the show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's under this video. So yeah, wonderful organization.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. And Livingstone's coaching. And now we're doing mentoring and consulting. So that's the addition in the last year plus. But most of my work was coaching partners. And like I said, I do a little bit. I can't take on as many couples as I'd like. So we are actually looking at launching some couples workshops, once a month couples workshops in the fall of 2024. Which is going to be, we're going to kind of intersect this betrayal trauma addiction realm with the neurodiverse piece, which is
Yes.
we're still talking to all the amazing researchers in the field and saying we got to intertwine this. So that's going to be a little bit customized to different people at different spots in their journey. My husband does do part-time mentoring with guys just to really help them in that initial step of what might they need. Is it 12-step they need? Do they need a CSAT support, certified sex addiction therapist? What might they need in their mentoring? So he's coming alongside. He has a career in the medical field. And so that's his primary work. But I talked him into doing this. So I said, I need you. I need you as a little bit of a wingman. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
we do, some things together. And yeah, and then I'm consulting and on the APSATS board. So I get to work with, newer coaches and clinicians that are coming on board and learning the APSATS model and get to give back through my board service. And we're doing a lot of great things and conferences coming up and things like that. So
yeah.
yeah.
Well, Shawna, I am so honored that we've had this conversation. And we've mentioned your book a couple times, Determined for More, a story of perseverance through divorce, betrayal trauma, emotional deprivation, and autism. Um, and we will absolutely have the links to your book and Livingstone's coaching, where if you're listening, it's in the show notes. If you're watching, check under this video. The links are all there. I've been privileged to read your story. This conversation has been awesome, Shawna. Thank you so much.
You are so welcome. It's an honor to be here. Thank
Many
you.
blessings to you.
Thank you.
Well, this is when you really need to check the links, folks. The links will include Shawna's website, Livingstone's coaching, and some social media around that, to her book, Determined for More, a story of perseverance through divorce, betrayal trauma, emotional deprivation, and autism, and also APSATS. the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. Especially if you are a partner of someone who has problematic sexual behavior, APSATS has people who have been trained in that high quality model of helping all across the country. So check the APSATS website, and there is going to be someone that you can connect with to get some help. We've talked about some hard things on this conversation, and we were only able to touch some of the surface aspects that are just so overwhelming in a challenging relationship like Shawna and her husband have experienced. But they are still married. That wasn't a foregone conclusion many times through their story. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, as she said, but there is hope for you too. I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment under this video. I read every one, and if I can be helpful, I respond. You can also leave me a confidential message at drcarolministries.com and use the contact page there. That's confidential, and it comes right to me. I want to again mention my recently released book, Sexpectations: Reframing Your Good and Not So Good Stories About God, Love, and Relationships. You can find out where you can get this copy. You can get it anywhere, but you can find out more about the book at yoursexpectations.com. This is about looking at your sexual story and bringing Jesus into your story so that you can find the healing and transformation that you need. Check that out. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel so every time we put something up, you can get notified. And until next time, may God bless you.